In the vast ancient forests of Michigan, one family carved an empire from timber. They were the Hartwicks, a name that once echoed with unimaginable wealth and power. They built towns, tamed rivers, and amassed a fortune that seemed as endless as the forests themselves. But empires, just like the tallest pines, are destined to fall. This isn't merely a story of riches to ruin. It's the story of how a fortune that shaped a state turned to stone, leaving behind a legacy of both creation and destruction that you can still walk through today. It's a story about the raw ambition that built America, the personal tragedy that forged a new purpose, and the profound irony of preserving the very thing you once set out to conquer. To understand the Hartwick story, you have to picture the world that made them possible. The latter half of the 19th century in Michigan was a full-blown gold rush. But this gold wasn't yellow and buried in the earth. It was green, and it towered hundreds of feet into the sky. This was the age of white pine. Before the Civil War, Michigan's Lower Peninsula was an immense, almost impenetrable wilderness. Surveyors described a sea of giant trees, a primeval forest dominated by eastern white pine. Some of these trees were ancient, over 200 years old, shooting 200 feet into the sky with trunks 5 feet across. To early settlers, this was an obstacle. But to a new breed of industrialist, it was a treasure map. As the pine forests back east in states like Maine and New York were exhausted, the nation's insatiable appetite for lumber turned westward. Michigan, with its seemingly endless supply of prime timber and a network of rivers for transport, was the perfect next frontier. The demand was staggering. A growing America needed wood for its cities, homes, factories, and railroads. After the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 leveled the city, it was Michigan lumber that rebuilt it, sent across Lake Michigan in massive log rafts. This is the world that created the timber barons, men who looked at a forest and saw a factory floor waiting to be cleared. Men like Charles Hackley in Muskegon, Perry Hanna in Traverse City, and the Danish immigrants who would build the Hartwick family fortune. The story begins not with a single patriarch, but with a trio of titans: Rasmus Hansen, Nels Michelson, and Ernest Salling. In 1878, they founded the Salling-Hansen Lumber Company in Grayling, Michigan. And it is Nels Michelson who is the key to our story, for his daughter Karen would one day hold the family's entire legacy in her hands. The Salling-Hansen Company and its sister operations were more than just local businesses. They were engines of commerce that dominated the region, transforming the landscape with brutal industrial precision. From 1870 to 1900, Michigan became the undisputed lumber king of the nation. In its peak year, 1889, the state produced a mind-boggling 5.5 billion board feet of lumber. To put that in perspective, if you lined up those boards end to end, they would circle the earth nearly 42 times. The sound of the North Woods was not birdsong. It was the sharp ring of the axe, the grinding groan of the saw, and the thunderous crash of another giant hitting the forest floor. Building this empire required more than ambition. It required an army. The lumberjacks, or shanty boys as they were known, were the foot soldiers of this green gold rush. They were typically young, single men, immigrants from Scandinavia and Canada, or veterans of the logged-out forests back east. Their lives were defined by hardship and punishing labor. They lived in remote logging camps deep in the woods, often for months at a time. The camps were Spartan: a bunkhouse, a cook shanty, a blacksmith shop, and a barn for the horses and oxen. The men rose before dawn and worked until dusk, 6 days a week, often eating their midday meal in the freezing winter air. The work was not just grueling, it was incredibly dangerous. Felling a multi-ton tree was a deadly art form where one wrong move could be fatal. Falling branches that killed loggers had a chilling name: widowmakers. It wasn't just a saying, it was a grim, frequent reality. Winter was the primary logging season. The snow and ice created a slick highway for giant sleds, piled high with logs to be dragged to the nearest riverbank. There, thousands of logs would be stacked, each one stamped with the company's log mark, a crude brand to prove ownership when the logs were mixed together downstream. When the spring thaw arrived, the most perilous job of all began: the river drive. As the rivers swelled with melted snow, the logs were rolled into the water to begin their journey to the sawmills. The river drivers, or river hogs, earned their higher pay. They had to balance on spinning logs in freezing water using long, sharp poles called peavies to break up log jams. A single jam could hold back a fortune in timber, and breaking it was a gamble with life itself. The sudden release of pressure could crush a man in an instant. At the river mouths in boom towns like Saginaw and Muskegon, the sawmills waited. By the 1880s, Muskegon had 47 sawmills screaming around its lake, running on steam power, turning the raw forest into the building blocks of a nation. The money flowing in was staggering. For a time, Muskegon boasted more millionaires per capita than any other city in America. The timber barons built colossal mansions, becoming the new aristocracy. This was the source of the Hartwick family's power. It was new money, raw money, smelling of pine sap and sawdust. But it was wealth generated by dismantling a natural wonder. The companies became so efficient that the very resource their empire was built on was vanishing before their eyes. Loggers who once thought Michigan's forests would last a century were shocked to see the virgin pine mostly gone in just 20 years. The land they left behind was a desolate wasteland of stumps and scrub known as the cutover. The boom was always destined to become a bust. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Hartwick story shifts from a faceless corporation to the people who inherited its complex legacy. The narrative now centers on two individuals: Karen Michelson, daughter of timber tycoon Nels Michelson, and the man she married, Edward E. Hartwick. Edward Hartwick wasn't someone who simply married into money. He was an impressive figure in his own right, a man who perfectly embodied the ambitious spirit of the age. Born in 1871, he grew up in Grayling, the heart of his future father-in-law's timber empire. He was intelligent and driven, earning an appointment to the prestigious West Point Military Academy in 1889 and graduating with honors. His army career began in the cavalry, but the romance of that life soon met the grim reality of war. Hartwick served in the Spanish-American War, a conflict that announced America's arrival as a global power. He was there, on the ground in Cuba, a young officer watching the world change. In 1898, after the war, he married Karen Bessie Michelson, uniting his own ambition with one of Michigan's most powerful lumber fortunes. He resigned his Army commission and plunged into the family business, becoming a major player in lumber and banking. He excelled, eventually moving to the booming city of Detroit, where he became a respected figure in business and society. But the call to serve, it seems, never truly left him. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Edward Hartwick, now in his mid-40s and a successful businessman, rejoined the Army. This wasn't a young man seeking adventure. This was a seasoned leader answering a call to duty. In recognition of his experience, he was commissioned as a major. This decision would become the central tragedy of the Hartwick family. In 1918, while serving in France, Major Edward E. Hartwick contracted spinal meningitis. On March 31st, he died in a military hospital. He was only 46 years old. His death was a profound shock. A man who was both a war hero and a captain of industry was struck down in his prime. For his wife Karen, the loss was devastating. She was now a widow, left with a massive fortune from a dying industry and an immense, painful grief. At the same time, the economic engine that had powered their lives was grinding to a halt. The great timber boom was over. The endless forests were gone. The Hartwick timber fortune, once a flood of green gold, was now a quiet pool. The fall of the empire wasn't a sudden crash, but a slow, fading echo, marked by an immense personal tragedy. Karen Hartwick stood at a crossroads, holding a legacy built on consumption, now facing a future defined by loss. What she did next wouldn't just redefine her family's name, it would turn its entire legacy on its head. After her husband's death, Karen Hartwick could have taken many paths. She could have quietly managed her inheritance, living a life of comfort. She could have liquidated the land assets and diversified into new industries. Instead, she chose a different route, one born from grief and a desire to create something permanent from a legacy of fleeting destruction. Her decision centered on one special place. The story goes that during their courtship, she and Edward often picnicked in a particular stand of old-growth forest near Grayling. a rare patch of virgin pine that had somehow escaped the axe. This place was personal. It was a sanctuary, a window into the world before the boom. By the 1920s, very little of this original forest remained. One of the last significant stands was an 85-acre grove near Grayling, still owned by her father's company, Salling Hansen. It had been spared by a fluke. The company had paused logging there during an economic downturn in 1893, and for one reason or another simply never returned. It was a forgotten island of giants. In 1927, Karen Hartwick did something extraordinary. She purchased over 8,000 acres of land from the Salling Hansen Company, including that precious 85-acre grove. Consider the weight of that act. The daughter of a logging company founder was buying back a piece of the wilderness that her family's business was designed to destroy. But she wasn't buying it for herself. Just one day later, she gifted the entire property, all 8,136 acres, to the state of Michigan. This was no simple donation. Karen attached a series of strict conditions. First, the park had to be a perpetual memorial to her late husband, Major Edward E. Hartwick. Second, and most critically, no more trees could ever be cut. The very activity that had made her family rich was now forbidden on this land forever. Third, a road must be built so the public could easily visit. Fourth, a memorial building in Edward's honor had to be erected. And finally, a logging museum must be built on the site. These weren't mere suggestions. They were legally binding commands. Karen wasn't just saving a forest, she was curating a legacy. She was petrifying the family fortune, transforming it from liquid cash into a permanent cultural landmark. The museum would freeze a moment in time, telling the story of the shanty boys her family once employed, while the forest itself, protected forever, would stand as a living monument. The state accepted, and work began on the park, officially dedicated in 1932. During the Great Depression, the Civilian Conservation Corps, part of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, came to the park. The young men of the CCC meticulously built the Hartwick Pines Logging Museum, a replica of an old-time logging camp, and constructed the beautiful Hartwick Memorial Building, bringing Karen's vision to life. The irony is almost poetic. A fortune made from the destruction of Michigan's forests was used to save the last remnants of them. The legacy of a timber baron family was now irrevocably tied to conservation. The story of their rise is now told in a museum, while the story of their fall was, in reality, the birth of a public trust. The fortune wasn't lost. It was converted from private wealth into a shared heritage. Today, nearly a century after Karen Hartwick's incredible gift, Hartwick Pine State Park stands as a living testament to her vision. Now covering over 9,600 acres, it is one of the largest state parks in Michigan's Lower Peninsula. And at its heart is the treasure she saved, the old-growth forest. Though a powerful windstorm on Armistice Day in 1940 reduced the grove from 85 to 49 acres, the remaining stand is still a place of profound awe. To step into this forest is to step back in time. An accessible trail winds among towering pines, some over 350 years old and rising 160 feet tall. These are the giants that once covered Michigan, saplings when the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. To walk beneath them with sunlight filtering through needles high in the canopy is to connect with a primeval world that has almost completely vanished. The park meticulously fulfills every one of Karen Hartwick's conditions. The Hartwick Pines Logging Museum tells the story of the shanty boys, honoring their labor without glorifying the industry's destruction. Visitors can walk through the bunkhouse and mess hall, imagining the hard lives these men endured. Nearby, the Hartwick Memorial Building pays quiet tribute to Major Edward E. Hartwick, the man whose tragic death inspired this singular act of preservation. The park is a cherished destination for hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. They come to hike, to camp, and to walk among the giant trees. For many, it's a family tradition. People who first came as children with their grandparents now bring their own grandchildren, continuing a pilgrimage to this special place. The story of the Hartwick family is not a simple tale of a fortune won and lost. It is a more complex, uniquely American saga. It's the story of a family that became incredibly powerful by participating in the great and often brutal engine of 19th century expansion. They built an empire by harvesting a vast natural resource. But when faced with the end of that era and with a profound personal loss, the family's purpose was transformed. The fortune didn't vanish, it was petrified. Through the grief and foresight of one woman, Karen Michelson Hartwick, that wealth was redeemed. It was used to purchase and protect a piece of the very world her family had helped to dismantle. The name Hartwick, once a brand stamped on logs floating down a river, is now synonymous with preservation. The family empire, once measured in billions of board feet, is now measured in the 400-year-old growth rings of a living forest. Their legacy is not found in crumbling mansions or old stock certificates. It is in the quiet awe of a child looking up at a tree that seems to touch the sky. The Hartwick fortune didn't just fade away. It was given a new, permanent life, a timber empire that in the end chose to save the forest rather than conquer it.